Hi everyone, welcome to Newegg TV. My name is Paul and this is our video on proper motherboard care. Now if you're an experienced computer builder, a lot of this information will probably already be known to you. But if you're new, a lot of this information is very important to adhere to because computer parts are very delicate, especially the internals and especially the motherboard. So you always want to make sure that you handle it properly and use the proper precautions. Now bear in mind there's some additional stuff in the box here that I'm going to come back to a little bit later. But for now, here's our new motherboard, and you'll notice that it is protected by an anti-static bag. So that is going to be step one when handling a motherboard. Is you always want to have proper anti-static protection. There's a couple ways you can do this. The best way is to actually get an anti-static wristband like this. This is a Velcro version. You simply attach it to your wrist. You make sure that the metal part here makes contact with your skin. You ask for some help putting it on unless you're ambidextrous. Wait for it. There we go. Attach it to your wrist like so, and then you have a little clip right here. And the clip is what you're going to attach to a large metal object. The best large metal object to attach it to is going to be your computer case, like this one right here. You can simply clip it to any exposed metal part of the case, like so, and that will give you a constant ground between yourself and the case. Now, even more ideally is to have the case with a power supply installed and to actually have the power plug plugged in. That will ground the case to the ground, and that'll make sure that you're fully discharging any static that you have built up. Now, a lot of folks don't have an anti-static wrist strap like this, and that's okay, provided you don't live in an area that has a lot of static electricity. So for example, if you constantly walk up to a door, for example, with a metal handle and you touch it and you get shocked, then that is a warning. You live in a high static electricity area. Typically, if you live in a dry area with lots of wind, something to watch out for. So another option, if you don't have a static wrist strap like this, is to just have your case, have your power supply installed, have that plugged in, and frequently touch the exposed metal of the case, and that will discharge any static that's built up on you to the case and make sure that you don't accidentally discharge that to the motherboard, which has more sensitive components, and you could possibly do some damage to it. So now that you have adhered to proper ESD techniques, you can actually start taking a closer look at your motherboard. You can remove it from the anti-static bag like so. And then here you can see is our motherboard, and you'll notice there's lots of components on it. There's lots of exposed capacitors and transistors and that sort of thing. So you want to be as careful as possible while you're handling a motherboard. The best way to actually grip a motherboard is going to be by the edges along the sides here. You also have these plastic brackets along here, and sometimes you can grip it like so to give yourself a bit better of a grip. Bear in mind some motherboards have heat sinks like these. These aren't always the best way to grip the motherboard because they're not always fully secured and they can rock back and forth, so bear that in mind. The motherboard socket right here next to where the processor is installed, those will often have much sturdier brackets, so you can actually use those to handle them as well. Now generally speaking, if you've properly discharged any static shock that you have built up, you don't have too much to be concerned about as far as handling the motherboard by the bottom, but just generally speaking, be as careful as you can and make sure that you don't, for instance, accidentally grip any of these capacitors that are just sticking up off the top. Those can rock back and forth and fairly easily break off, so bear that in mind. Now, now that you have properly know how to handle the motherboard, you're going to want to move forward with your build, installation in the case, and that sort of thing. Now we have a full video on this, so if you're interested, you can head over to our Newegg YouTube channel. You can look in the tutorial section. We'll have a full video on how to properly install all of the components in your case, including the motherboard. So for instance, you want to make sure that you use motherboard standoffs to put space between the motherboard and your case. There's some other key elements like that to proper motherboard handling and care. But apart from that, as long as you've done the proper ESD techniques, then you shouldn't have too much trouble. But there is one other key area of the motherboard where there's frequent confusion and also a very high level of possibility that you might cause some damage, and that is with the CPU socket right here. So here I have a few different motherboards. The one on my right here, this Gigabyte motherboard, is an AMD motherboard. This is socket FM1. AMD also has socket AM2, AM3, AM2 Plus, and AM3 Plus sockets. They all use roughly the same type of mechanism for actually installing the CPU and keeping that protected. Relatively speaking, it's a little bit sturdier on the motherboard side for AMD processors and motherboards versus Intel, and we're going to come back to Intel, which has the LGA sockets over here in just a moment. So for starters, Here's a closer look at the socket. You'll notice there is no protective covering over the socket, and that is because all you have is a bunch of holes that the pins on the CPU drop down into. Both the FM1 socket here as well as the AM2 and AM3 sockets use the same type of lever mechanism. You raise the lever up like this to release and sort of unlock the socket so you can drop the processor in, and then once it's in you simply lock it down like that, and then you can go ahead with your heatsink fan installation. Now, one very important thing to note with all processors is that you need to make sure when you're installing them that you're using the right orientation. So here is our FM1 socket CPU. You'll notice right here that there is a heat spreader up on top. Then on the bottom is the delicate part, and that's all of those hundreds and hundreds of little pins that need to drop down properly in the socket. You also notice that this is not necessarily symmetrical. It's actually keyed in a certain way so that you can only install it in a certain way. You can install it not the right way, but what you'll end up doing there is bending these delicate little pins and even possibly breaking them. And one bent pin that's not properly in the socket will mean that your motherboard, well, your entire computer will not work properly. But apart from that, fairly simple to install. Simply raise up the lever like that to release the arm. You can use sort of a reality check method by looking at the way that the pins are on the bottom, but a slightly easier way is to note that there is a gold arrow on one corner of the CPU right there. You simply match that up with the arrow on the socket, which happens to be on this upper corner right there. It's often on the socket itself as well as the motherboard. Simply line up that arrow with the arrow on the CPU with the arm raised, drops down into the socket. Note that there is zero insertion force needed. It just dropped right down. I didn't need to press down. If you set the CPU on the socket and it doesn't drop in like that, take it out, double check, make sure that you have it oriented correctly. It should drop in, you should lower the arm, and now it's locked into place. So that is the fairly simple installation procedure for an AMD CPU. Now, if we're moving on to Intel CPUs, we have a few different sockets available. These are what is known as LGA sockets. So we have an LGA 1155 socket on this motherboard, and then on the left here we have an LGA 2011 for Intel's Enthusiast series. Now, both of these sockets, you'll notice, already have a protective plastic cover on them, and that's very important. You want to keep this protective plastic cover on at all times until you're ready to install your CPU. Also, you want to make sure you keep this plastic cover so that you can reattach it to the motherboard if you need to in the future, because one thing I'm going to go over towards the end of this video is actually if you need to return a motherboard or ship it anywhere, the proper procedures for doing that, and maintaining this plastic cover is key, because if you'll notice down inside our LGA 1155 socket right there, you can see all the pins. The pins roughly equivalent to the pins that you saw on the AMD CPU just a few moments ago, only this time they're on the motherboard socket, not on the CPU. A few key aspects to this. One is that the pins actually in this socket are more delicate. They're smaller, they're finer than the pins on an AMD CPU, so they're even more delicate and even more easy to bend accidentally. That being said, for our 1155 socket, there's a simple lever that's locked into place. You can fold it back like that, and then the socket cover right there should automatically fold back. At this point, be very careful. Again, you have the exposed socket there. You don't want anything pushing down on that. You don't want to drop a screw on there or anything like that. You want to keep that socket pristine. From there, the installation procedure is similar to what you saw with AMD. Here is our Intel processor. You'll notice it just has gold contact pads there on the bottom rather than actual pins that stick out. But the same with AMD. You have a gold arrow at one corner right there. You can also just reality check the orientation of this. Another thing that you have on the Intel CPUs, at least on this 1155 CPU, is you have two notches here on either side. So you can use the gold arrow, you can use those notches to line up with the socket. Let me just set this down for a moment. So on the socket here, you'll notice there's two notches here at the top and the bottom, and you also have an arrow, which should be, the arrow which is on the bracket right there. So corner of the bracket, you'll notice there's also an arrow. So I usually use the notches to double check with an Intel CPU, but you want to drop it down straight into the socket. Again, no force is needed to press down on it. It should drop straight in. You don't need to wiggle it, move it, or anything like that. Once it's dropped in, you simply close the retention plate like so, push down and lock, and your CPU is locked into place. And lastly, we move on to the massive LGA 2011 socket, also from Intel. And you'll notice here, as I said, massive, this is a much larger socket, but the same general principles apply, that being that you do have a plastic protective cover right here. You want to pop that off when you're ready to install your processor, and make sure you hold on to it because you will need it in the future if you ever need to remove your processor and keep that socket protected. Now, as far as the actual installation of the CPU goes with this one, it's not too tough. You do have two arms that you need to pop up. So you have this one with the little U-shaped bend on it, which you can pop up like so and release, and then you have another one with sort of a V shape to it, pop up on the other side. At that point, you can raise that arm because it will latch down on the one side here. Then you can actually sort of push down on the U-shaped one. That will pop up the bracket, and you can lift it up like so. Now at this point, you could actually latch these back down if you wanted to keep them out of the way for your CPU installation. That's sort of a matter of preference, but we'll give you a little bit more clearance as you're installing your processor. Now for our LGA 2011 processor right here, again, very delicate, so we want to make sure that we handle this properly. So for example, on the opposite side here again, we have 2011 of these gold contact pads. Make sure you don't touch those. Grip it by the sides. It's also best to try not to touch the actual contact plate right there because you don't want to get any oils from your skin on it. Now again, here we have some notches, so there's actually two on the top and two on the bottom for LGA 2011. And again, you have the gold arrow at one corner. That gold arrow will correspond to an arrow on the actual bracket, so you can see it down right there, sort of etched into the bracket. You can also use the notches on the CPU itself to determine the proper orientation for installation. You'll notice that they're slightly offset, so there's a bit wider gap on this side than there is over here. So after you've determined the proper installation orientation for the processor, again, same method, you just want to drop it straight down into the socket. Here's an example of why it's good to sometimes pop that bracket back down to keep it out of your way. Keep it lined up properly and drop it straight down into the socket. Again, no pressure needed. You just drop it in. It should align as is. You don't need to wiggle it around or anything like that. Then you're going to sort of go a backwards procedure to lock this bracket back down. First with the V-shaped bracket over here on the side, and then with the U-shaped bracket on this side. And now your LGA 2011 processor is installed. Now at this point, I want to reiterate that we are really focusing on just a few key aspects of the entire computer building process. So again, if you're building a new computer, especially if you're a first timer, head over to our Newegg YouTube channel. Look in the tutorial sections. We have a 3-part video on how to properly install all of the components in a computer, as well as getting it all set up and good to go.